taking a closer look at something that's been generating a ton of buzz, a lot of questions, frankly, some head scratching, I think it's safe to say, and that is the box office performance. The opening weekend performance of Disney's live-action Snow White.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because on the surface, the numbers look pretty decent. It topped the charts for the weekend, brought in, 43 million domestically, around 87 million globally.
Yeah, and it's already the second biggest opening we've seen this year.
Exactly. So you see those headlines, and you might think, okay, Smash hit another Disney live-action remake doing its thing. But the conversation, the chatter that we're seeing, it goes a little deeper than that, right? There's this underlying sense of, well, disappointment, I guess is the word.
Yeah, and that's really what we want to unpack today. A lot of you reached out wanting to understand this disconnect, right?
Yeah.
Like, why does a number one movie, a Disney movie at that, feel like it's underperforming, feel like it's maybe even a bit of a flop?
Right. And I think to get to the bottom of that, we really need to do a few things. We need to look at the context of the box office as a whole. How has the year been performing up to this point? We need to compare Snow White's numbers to other Disney live-action adaptations, because that's really the measuring stick here. And of course, we have to consider those initial reactions, both from critics and audiences, because that early word of mouth plays a huge role in how a film ultimately performs.
Absolutely. So let's start with that context. You mentioned, the box office landscape leading up to Snow White's release.
Yeah, so one thing to keep in mind is that the early part of 2025 hasn't exactly been setting records at the box office. There's been a lot of talk about a slower start to the year, fewer films crossing that $100 million mark on their opening weekends.
Yeah, it's interesting. We haven't seen that one massive breakout hit yet that really gets everyone talking.
Right, so in that sense, Snow White topping the charts, it's almost like winning by default. It's still a significant achievement, don't get me wrong, but it's not necessarily indicative of the kind of blockbuster performance that we typically associate with these big Disney releases.
That's like being the tallest kid in kindergarten.
Exactly. You're still the tallest, but it's all relative.
Okay, so let's bring in those other Disney live-action adaptations, really put these Snow White numbers into perspective.
All right, so just to rattle off a few of the heavy hitters for context, we're talking about films like The Lion King raking in a staggering 191 million on its opening weekend.
Wow, yeah, that was a phenomenon.
Beauty and the Beast not too far behind at 174 million. Then you've got Alice in Wonderland at 116 million. The Jungle Book clearing 103 million. The Little Mermaid with 95 million, and Aladdin at 91 million.
Yeah, these are the behemoths, the ones that really set the bar.
And even when you look at some of the adaptations that didn't quite reach those heights, you still have Maleficent at 69 million, Cinderella at 67 million.
Okay.
Even Snow White and the Huntsman, which took a much darker reimagining, brought in 56 million.
So that's really where this conversation gets interesting, right? Because when you see those numbers laid out, Snow White's 43 million, it starts to look, well, a little less impressive.
Exactly. It lands pretty squarely near the bottom of the pack, just a smidge above Mufasa. The Lion King, which came in at 35 million, and Dumbo with 46 million.
Yeah, you start to see why some are using the B word, the bomb word, which, might seem harsh. But when you're talking about Disney and these kinds of budgets, it's a different ballgame.
Right, and that's a really crucial point. It's not just about being number one for the weekend. It's about meeting those financial expectations. And when you look at the reported budget for Snow White, somewhere in the neighborhood of $270 million.
That's a lot of fairy dust to recoup.
It is. That puts it up there with some of the most expensive films ever made, and suddenly a $43 million opening weekend. Well, it doesn't seem quite as celebratory, does it? Your sources even draw a comparison to the Marvels, which had a similar budget around 270 million and a slightly higher opening at 46.1 million. But still, that was widely considered a disappointment for Disney.
And to your point about those big budgets,
Yeah.
Snow White's right up there with films like Indiana Jones and The Dial of Destiny, which also faced a lot of scrutiny for its box office performance.
Right, and one of your sources, the Rotten Tomatoes article, even brings up Dumbo as a point of comparison. Now, Dumbo did open a bit higher than Snow White at 45.9 million, but it also had a significantly smaller budget, around 170 million, and while it did go on to make a decent chunk of change overseas, they call it a quaint bomb, which I kind of love.
Quaint bum. I'm going to have to remember that one.
But the fact that we're even mentioning Snow White in the same breath, with a much higher budget, that's what really raises those eyebrows.
Okay, so not great news financially speaking.
Yeah.
But hey, there's always the chance of a comeback, right? One of the reports you sent actually mentions Mufasa, The Lion King, as a potential example of a film that started slow but ended up becoming a huge success.
Yeah, Mufasa is definitely an interesting case. It didn't exactly light up the box office on its opening weekend, but it did eventually become a global hit, pulling in over $700 million worldwide. But I'm hesitant to draw too many parallels to Snow White here.
I was going to say, that seems like a bit of a reach.
Mufasa was an original story within an already beloved franchise. It had that built-in audience and the time to build word of mouth. Snow White, on the other hand, well, it's an adaptation of a very well-known story, a classic for sure, but maybe not riding the same wave of popularity as, say, a Lion King or a Frozen.
And we can't ignore those early reactions.
Right.
The mixed reviews, the criticisms that seem to be focused on some pretty fundamental elements of the film.
Exactly, and that's where those initial reviews become so crucial. They really do set the tone. In Snow White's case, that tone, it's a little bit all over the place. Critics on Rotten Tomatoes, they've got it at a pretty lukewarm 44%, which is, not exactly a ringing endorsement.
Oh, yeah, that's not great.
Audiences seem to be a bit more forgiving with a 74% score, but that kind of split, especially with critics leaning negative, it can definitely impact a film's long-term prospects.
Yeah, that could be a tough hurdle to overcome.
Yeah.
Audiences might be a little hesitant to spend their money, especially on a film that's already getting some negative buzz.
Right, and it's interesting because even within those critical reviews, there are some very specific points of praise and criticism. Rachel Zegler's performance, her singing especially, it's being consistently highlighted as a major strength, even a single bright spot in some cases. But then you have the criticisms, which seem to be aimed at some pretty core aspects of the film.
Yeah, I was reading about that. Concerns about Gal Gadot's portrayal, some issues with the overall structure and pacing of the story, the script itself, some questions about the directing choices, and then, of course, those CGI dwarves, which have been a whole conversation on their own.
Oh yeah, those dwarves, they've definitely generated some strong opinions. And it's fascinating to me that even Snow White and the Huntsman, which, took a much darker and less traditional approach to the story, even that film managed a stronger opening weekend. And that suggests to me that maybe audiences were a little more open to a different take on the classic fairy tale back then than they are now.
So we've got this combination of factors, right? The underperformance at the box office, the mixed reviews, the criticisms of some key elements of the film, and the adaptation of a classic that maybe isn't resonating as strongly with audiences today as some other Disney properties. It's not a great recipe for success.
It's definitely a challenging situation, and it really underscores the immense pressure these live-action adaptations face. They're not just trying to retell a beloved story. They're trying to capture the magic of the original while also appealing to a modern audience and doing it all with these massive budgets looming over them.
It's a high-wire act for sure.
Yeah.
So where does this leave Disney? What can they learn from Snow White's performance, and how might it impact their approach to these live-action adaptations moving forward?
Well, I think it's still too early to say definitively what the long-term impact will be, but it certainly raises some important questions. Are audiences becoming more discerning, more selective about which of these adaptations they're willing to embrace? Is there a formula for success that Disney may be struggling to recapture? And how do they balance that nostalgia factor with the need to innovate and bring something fresh to these classic stories?
Yeah, those are big questions, and I think it'll be fascinating to see how Disney responds both creatively and strategically to the challenges that Snow White has presented.
Absolutely. And on one thing's for sure, they're not slowing down on the live action front. Your sources actually give us a little glimpse into what's coming down the pipeline.
Oh, yeah. Let's talk about that. What else do they have in the works?
So we've got a live action Lilo and Stitch slated for release in May 2025. The trailer actually just dropped recently, and there's been a lot of excitement around that one, especially if they manage to capture Stitch's unique charm.
Yeah, that one has the potential to be huge, especially if they get Stitch right.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Then there's a live-action Moana in development, which I think a lot of people are expecting to be massive given the popularity of the original and, of course, Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson's involvement.
Yeah, Moana, that's a no-brainer. That one's going to be huge.
And then we've got a Hercules adaptation in the works with Guy Ritchie directing, which is already generating a ton of buzz online about potential casting, and a live action. Tangled is also in the early stages with a director and writer attached.
Wow, so they're really going all in on these live-action remakes. It's going to be really interesting to see how these films perform in light of Snow White's reception.
Agreed. It's almost like Snow White is this unexpected test case, a bit of a wake-up call potentially, that might force Disney to reevaluate their approach and really fine-tune their strategy for these adaptations moving forward.
So the big takeaway here, it seems, is that while Snow White might have technically won the weekend, its performance is far from a fairy tale ending. It's a reminder that box office success is about more than just big names and familiar stories. It's about meeting those sky-high expectations, capturing the zeitgeist, and delivering an experience that truly resonates with audiences.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And I think it's a great jumping-off point for further discussion. What does the reception of Snow White tell us about the current state of Hollywood? Is there a growing disconnect between critical reception and audience enjoyment? And how are studios navigating this increasingly complex landscape of remakes, reboots, and sequels? Lots to think about, for sure.
Absolutely. We'll certainly be keeping a close eye on all of this as it continues to unfold.